I'm going to make a start and say welcome. Good afternoon, everybody. We're delighted to have you joining Renewable UK's Futures Forum, the Net Zero Sessions. We've got an amazing programme lined up for you today, and I need to say thank you very much to everybody who is speaking on our panels. We're really excited to hear from you, and hopefully people will enjoy the day, but find it informative as well. Before I introduce our first speaker of the day, I do need to just say a big thank you to our event sponsors. Our headline sponsor is Ørsted, a renewable energy company that is taking tangible action to create a world that runs entirely on green energy. And our supporting sponsors, Siemens Gamesa, Dogger Bank Wind Farm and Vattenfall. So without any further ado, I'm delighted to welcome Adam Vaughan as our keynote speaker, who is going to be kicking things off for us today. Adam is the chief reporter at New Scientist magazine, so we're incredibly lucky to have him today because I know how busy he is authoring the Fix the Planet weekly newsletter as part of his work. He's a former energy correspondent and environment editor at The Guardian and has over 20 years experience in journalism. Not that you'd know that by looking at him, of course not. And frankly, what he doesn't know about the climate debate and net zero is not worth knowing. So Adam, without any further ado, I give you the virtual floor.
Thank you so much, Melanie. And thank you to Renewable UK for having me here. And thank you to you for joining this session and listening to me. What I'm really looking forward to today is your questions and having a go at answering them. So please start having a think. And in the meantime, I'm here to give a little speech. So just bear with me as I give you that. It's 21 years ago, incredibly, since I was last a student. It's been only 3 years since the phrase net zero began to enter common usage. And it's obviously been around before that, but the thing that really brought it to the forefront was a new report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And it's just it's just 2 years since the UK government passed a law to make the country reach net zero by 2050. UK is far from alone. There's half a dozen other countries have also proposed laws, and dozens more have promised to do net zero, including, importantly, the US after Joe Biden took power. So by the time most of you are my age, I'm making some assumptions about your ages there, so forgive me if you don't fall into that category. The UK will hopefully be on the brink of net zero. Scotland should be even closer. This raises all sorts of questions about what sort of job you'll be doing by then. In my reporting over the years, I've been lucky enough to meet all sorts of people working towards a net zero world. So I've met people who used to work at Asda who now build wind turbine blades. I've met electricians who used to work on new build houses who now climb up turbines and offshore wind farms. I've met young entrepreneurs who now have energy companies with billions of revenues who are helping the switch to net zero. I mention those few examples just because this is a Renewable UK event, but other examples are available. But I think possibly what I want to speak about today, maybe we can get into the jobs question in the Q&A in a minute, but what I want to talk today is probably about the bigger picture, really. Because net zero also raises huge questions about what your daily life will be like in the future and the society, the cities and towns and the countryside around you. So for my speech today, I'm going to read you some excerpts from a feature I've just spent a few weeks reporting for New Scientist, which hasn't been published yet. So you are the first people in the world, apart from my editors, to enjoy it. It's imagining what a day will look like when we've reached net zero. So at the start of the feature, I talk about the fact that despite countries setting net zero targets, few leaders have really fully digested what a wholesale transformation of economies and behaviour that is going to entail. Fewer still have drawn a sort of vivid vision or a picture of what daily life will be like at net zero, from our homes, the food we eat, to travel, and much more. I spoke to Mike Thompson at the UK's Climate Change Committee, and he told me, I think we probably don't do that enough, the vision thing. It's a really helpful thing to do to take away the fear and to get people excited. And I think anyone who's seen some recent stuff on GB News might sort of relate to that. So what follows is an attempt to fill the gap, that vision gap, following a day in the life of Isla in 2050. She's a child today. And by its nature, obviously, it's speculative. but it is informed by experts and research and trials today. You should also bear in mind it's not something I ever intended to read aloud, so it may come across as a bit cheesy in parts, so just bear with me. So when the alarm goes off, the torrential rain outside is almost enough to send Isla back under the duvet. That's unusual for a summer's day. Drier and much hotter summers have been the norm for years here in the south of the UK. Mind you, more unpredictable weather has become a feature of life in recent years. Fortunately, Isla's home is the same steady 20 degrees it is all day long. It's comfortable and unbothered by drafts. The idea of a home where the temperature fluctuates constantly like her mother had is alien to her. She doesn't even know what the temperature is. An algorithm learned the warmth she prefers. Walking downstairs, she glimpses the unit in her garden that extracts heat from the air. Apart from some relatives in Yorkshire who still have hydrogen boilers from a big trial back in the 2020s, everyone she knows has a heat pump like this. Making a cup of tea, Isla's kettle looks exactly the same as the ones her mother used 3 decades ago. But 95% of the electricity for it comes from wind and solar farms, a far cry from the 40% in 2020. The milk in her tea came from a cow. She's quite old-fashioned in that way, but she still seeks it out despite plant-based milk being ubiquitous. Today's a rare in-person day for her at the office, and usually she owns rather than shares an electric car. It's one of the reasons she never bothered with a home battery. When she charged it last night, a glut of wind power saw prices flip positive, which earned her some money on it. Charging stopped just a few minutes ago, so the battery's warm, running at its most efficient. Driving out of town, she passes rows and rows of houses and offices with green roofs. They soon give way to a former industrial estate, which is now rows of boxes that look a little like jet engines, their fans whirring away. These are machines to capture CO2 directly from the air, fitted a few years ago by that big CO2 removal firm, Shell. The brief journey up the motorway sees her whizzing past the lorry lane with the tram-style power cables that run above the trucks, charging them as they go. One thing she does notice is there are more power pylons running alongside the road than when she was a child. Back-to-back meetings at the office are followed by lunch out. At the restaurant, her and her companion both choose a burger. It's not from an animal, obviously. Beef is on the menu as a high-end rarity with lots of words expended on its husbandry and the genetic editing of the herds to curb the methane emissions from the beef. But it's too expensive for this casual lunch, so she has a plant-based burger, which does just fine. Sleepy afterwards, she heads home. She's got a half day, it's quite good in the future, and she heads home for a walk to wake herself up. The great southern forest seems to go on forever these days, but it's a welcome refuge from the mid-afternoon heat, which is fast evaporating the morning's rain. She emerges from the wood, she walks uphill through the looming elephant grass that will soon be harvested to make fuel for the planes flying ahead. From the highest point, she can see a handful of cattle and sheep. She finds it hard to imagine these rolling hills were once filled with them. Afterwards, her home is still cool. Like most of her neighbours, she has no air conditioning, but automatic shutters for her windows, a big awning for shade, and a natural ventilation system. That evening, she calls friends. One sits chatting with the sea behind her, the 236 metres, God, that is taller than I thought, 236 metre tall blaze of the Hornsea Free wind farm just about visible. Another friend in London bemoans the second 38-degree plus day they've had this year. Winding down later, she plots a holiday. She skims past the long-haul flights, which some of her friends still take despite the rising cost of mandatory CO2 removals and their moral disapproval that flying attracts. Happily, as she scrolls before bed, she finds the perfect option to dream about, a luxury train tour of Norwegian vineyards. I'd quite like to go on one of those at the moment. Okay, so that's the story. I did make up the story, but I didn't make up the trends, the policies, and the projects underway now that have informed it. So just, excuse me, I'm just going to briefly break down some of those, some of the areas that inform that. One is homes. So homes in 2050 are likely to look similar to today's. That's what the experts I spoke to tell me, but they'll feel and run differently behind the scenes. So energy efficiency and insulation, and given that they will be much improved, everything that can be electrified will be. So offshore wind farms, I mentioned Hornsea 3 there, which is capable of powering about 2 million homes and was approved last December. That's going to be the backbone of that low carbon grid that I talked about. In the UK, today, more than 4/5 of homes are heated with gas boilers. By 2050, that's probably going to be a heat pump, which is effectively a reverse refrigerator that extracts heat from the air or the ground to warm a fluid, which is compressed and raises the temperature even higher. Thompson at the CCC, he says it's the most common scenario in our research. Only about 30,000 of these are being installed a year today versus more than 1 million gas boilers annually. But the government is planning a heat and building strategy to meet a target of 600,000 a year by 2028. So we've got a long way to go. But falling costs are expected as more installers come into the market, and new homes and homes off the gas grid are the places where they're expected to probably be taken up quickest. Hydrogen's not necessarily out of the running. There is a trial of a hydrogen powered village plan for 2025, and with a town possibly following by 2030. Gas hobs for cooking are likely made way for electric induction hobs, but combustion in homes may not be entirely a thing of the past. The odd home may still burn wood, for example, if it hasn't been banned. Interestingly, opinions differ on how engaged or not we'll be with our energy use. So Alice Bell at the non-profit Possible, she told me, I think we'll be more conscious energy consumers. Either might well be thinking more about the energy she uses that day. They might check the weather so that if it's sunny, they know they have a cheaper energy tariff, and they set the washing machine and other devices accordingly. By contrast, Thompson, he thinks energy will not be something that people worry about. So because smart systems and algorithms will govern much of our home energy use. And this is obviously being used today, software such as that being used at the Living Lab, running by the Energy Systems Catapult, and there's lots of others as well. And then there's also that question of cooling. We might need more of. Thompson really hopes we don't have more of that, not so much because of the extra energy that would require, because demand for energy is relatively low in summer, and solar output sort of quite neatly matches when you'd need the cooling. But the concern is really actually about the urban heat island effects that those units might, or that aircon would cause at a local level. So second area is food and waste. So there is expected to be a big shift in our diets towards plants, but probably not to the level. I don't know if you've seen the film Carnage, it's a satirical film by the comedian Simon Amstell. It's a sort of all vegan meat mocking world. We don't think that is going to come across. Rebecca Willis at the Lancaster University says she doesn't think we'll be a nation of vegans. And to give you an idea of the numbers, the Climate Change Committee thinks that we will have a world where meat and dairy consumption is down about 35%, and he thinks that's in line with what we've seen in recent years. In its more extreme scenario, that's 50%. But that's as far as it thinks that will go. And I think another thing that might drive those trends, people think, so I spoke to Mark Maslin at University College London, he thinks that dietary shifts will be driven also by health concerns as well as climate concerns. And he talks about the role of pandemics, such as the one we're living through at the moment, in that. So I think that would be a really interesting one. And I think the general thinking seems to be that the move will be less towards lab-based meat and more towards a sort of plant-based kind we're seeing by companies such as Impossible Food and Beyond Meat, and that's probably largely because of reasons of scale and money. So I'm going to move on from food and waste. We can talk more about that if you want later on, to transport, which is probably more of interest for people here. So greater adoption of hybrid or remote working is likely to have curtailed some commuting, but traveling around is probably going to look familiar, just with most cars and vans running electricity or some sort of other energy carrier. So that may be hydrogen, for example. Need to give more space over to cycle lanes and green space for carbon capture and biodiversity reasons means there should be fewer cars. Most of those were likely to be shared, like some evolution of today's car clubs and ride-hailing services such as Uber. And the bus taking Isla's children to school will probably be battery electric too, says Thompson. And those trucks I mentioned those because that's a big, no one was quite sure what's going to happen with trucks, but one thing that is happening is tram-style sort of overhead lines to recharge them. There's already small pilots taking place in Sweden and Germany on that. Altogether, what it adds up to on transport is, as Maslin writes in his new book, is the air is cleaner than it's been since before the Industrial Revolution, which will be a big improvement on today. And another way that transport interacts with energy is cars will be charged when there's least pressure on electricity grids, such as overnight. So they'll feed back into the grid too, acting as a kind of aggregated mega battery to smooth out the variable nature of wind and solar power. Hayden Wood, he's the guy, the young entrepreneur I was sort of referring to at the start there. He works at the green energy firm Bulb. He says he's absolutely convinced such vehicle to grid technology will scale up. And then electrification is on transport will also extend to other things. So trains are most likely to be electric, maybe lower use lines will be hydrogen, and trains are also expected to replace a lot of our shorter plane journeys, but flying is clear from people I spoke to is not going away. The CCC, for example, expects flights to increase by mid-century, and come 2050 in the UK, aviation and farming will probably be the UK's two biggest sectors still releasing greenhouse gas emissions. Those planes that are still flying are likely to rely on some sort of biofuels or synthetic jet fuels, with the rest coming from oil. So with our example of Isla, when she books a flight, there won't be a box to tick for carbon offsets, because all flights will be offset through some form of carbon removal. The estimate is that using that CO2 removal and the sort of alternative fuels could add the cost of around £14 to a London to New York flight one way come 2050. And moving on to a different area, so land use, how we use land around us is going to change. The landscape should look quite drastically different. As Willis said to me, I can't imagine the countryside will look as it does now. There will be a lot more tree cover all over the country and a lot more mixed agriculture, i.e. arable and livestock, not the big flat green fields we see at the moment. That's because to remove and store CO2, peatland and forests need to be restored. And some part of that happens, part of the thinking is that happens is with the shift towards plant-based diets, freeing up about a fifth of our farmland for other uses such as tree planting. In some places, energy and food production is going to coexist on some land. So Willis's colleagues at Lancaster University predict solar panels in fields for the few sheep that are left grazing, for example. And just a little bit briefly on ways of removing CO2. Thompson says, we think the tree is the cheapest and most efficient way of doing this. So tree cover is expected to increase from 13% of UK land now to around 18% by 2050. So that gives you a sort of idea of the scale. That might not sound like a big shift, but in a country the size of the UK, that's quite huge. The UK is unlikely to be carpeted in those machines I mentioned with the sort of fictional version of Shell as a CO2 removal in the future. Those probably going to be about 1,000 hectares of land compared to about 1 million hectares of forest. So it's not like we're going to be all surrounded by massive air conditioning like machines. Melanie, can you do me a favor and just tell me how much time I've got left? Because I've got a couple other boxes, but
sure. Just a couple more minutes, and we have got some questions in the chat, and we need to.
Okay, cool. Well, I'll skip on a bit then. There's a bit I've got about how obviously the weather's going to change, which I think goes without saying that regardless of what we do about CO2 cuts, we are going to have this hotter and drier summers, wetter and warmer winters. I just want to briefly talk a little bit about how society may change. So obviously many of the changes will not be connected with climate change. If you think of the jump from a sort of pre-web life 30 years ago to today's society, and even the sort of shifts to net zero are likely to change some fundamentals. But one possibility is greater engagement with the public is undertaken to introduce the technology and the behaviour changes that are needed for net zero. So something like the 2020 Citizens Assembly in the UK, that could hopefully invigorate democracy at a local level. However, there are sort of differing opinions on whether that will come to pass. As Maslin said to me, it would be lovely to think of a utopia where greening and saving the planet makes people more engaged with local politics. He says, I'm a bit more cynical. One thing is clear, the status quo is not an option. As Bell says, change is coming. It's either coming from changes we make as a society, or it's going to come from the skies or the soil. I've got some more comments I can make about the sort of more, this is all very UK specific, but I can talk sort of about how some of these things might play out differently elsewhere. But maybe
should we move to the questions?
Wrap up and move to the questions there.
Yeah, we'll do that. That was great. I really enjoyed that. Thank you very much for giving us the sneak preview. The illustration through the storytelling is just, it is exactly that kind of narrative, in my opinion, that I think we need to get out to more people, because really understanding the changes, it's so difficult to get your head around, particularly when you're living your life now. You can't really imagine the changes. I mean, even, I don't know, 18 months ago, the idea that we'd be running a conference and it would all be online, it just seemed like, no, well, why would you do that? But, and yet here we are. So, obviously things can change and we do adapt, but making sure people are prepared for these changes that are going to come, absolutely important. So thank you for that, and I hope that it raised interesting points for our panel. Can we now move to the questions? We've had some questions come in for you, Adam, and please do, participants, got 70 odd people on online now, so please do send questions through while we've got Adam with us. The first one that came in from Nathan, who says, how much of the challenge for reaching net zero is actually us as consumers and our behaviours, and comments on our thirst for newness and our love of travel versus ensuring that the technology available can deliver as we expect and require.
I guess on the sort of individual action versus kind of collective action, it's that usual thing of it's not an either or. Clearly we need both, and I think there's good examples there, and some of the things I touched in this this sort of fictional story. For example, Isla's not going to be able to build a even if she wants a hydrogen boiler, say for example, she's not going to be able to build a hydrogen network across the UK herself. She's going to be reliant on government to set the policy levers for that, businesses to raise the capital and build it, and regulators to enable it, and so on. So it really is, I think the role, I think that said, there is a huge role for individual action, and that that comes through on a sort of, I suppose, principally, I suppose the two possibly most powerful areas of that are, as a consumer, so how you spend your pound, and where you choose to put it. Do you back net zero businesses that are setting aggressive net zero targets, or ones that are opposing action on this? That's one area, and also, and then I think not the other obvious, arguably much more powerful one is the political ballot box side of things. So I think really hope that increasingly that is something that there was a lot of talk that the last general election was the climate election, and I don't think that not sure that necessarily came to pass in the way people actually voted. But I think that those to me clearly are the two two of the most powerful things as an individual. But clearly a lot of this stuff is reliant on us acting. When I say us, I mean all actors in society, from the media to energy companies to government and so on. So yeah, you really do need both.
Brilliant, thank you. We've had a couple of questions on CCUS. So David asks, Adam, you mentioned Shell may have a CCUS future. What do you think is in store for the rest of today's oil giants? And then another question from John, who says, you mentioned carbon capture machines in your narrative. What do you think those might look like? It's
a good question. So on the oil giants, I think there are some people would hope there's some people who would certainly hope that they would just fall over tomorrow and die. I know that there's I think those companies are, my personal view would be that those companies are quite important actually for the energy transition, just partly because of their sheer size and their scale. They are global by nature, these companies. They are very good at doing big infrastructure projects and raising large amounts of money. The problem at the moment is that you have companies like Shell who have a capex, capital expenditure of around $22-25 billion a year, but you're only getting around 2 billion of that going on the low carbon element of things. So clearly, I think the pandemic has massively accelerated. If you can obviously see a lot of their plans have changed faster than they would necessarily have. BP is an obvious example. So they have revised their oil production forecasts and their plans for the future. However, they're clearly, what they're planning is clearly not in line with a net zero future. The International Energy Agency had quite an important report out last month, which you may have seen, which is this net zero report. And it wasn't a prescription, it was a scenario of how the world energy systems can get to net zero. And in that, they said that there would be no new oil and gas fields as of this year, and clearly that's not happening. And clearly the oil companies, and the only other point I would say on the oil companies, so I do think they have an important role to play. The only thing is I would say is we often all get, because they're the brands we see and on our high streets and so on, and we think of them immediately, but actually the international oil companies are a relatively small part of the picture compared to the national oil companies, the state-owned ones. And I think it's going to be really, that maybe comes back to my point earlier about the role of politics. because I don't know how you influence those companies otherwise, apart from cutting demand for their products. On the CO2 removals thing, I think this is just going to become a bigger and bigger issue. It's at the I've just actually spent there's another feature. I've spent a long time reporting on that, speaking to people. Interestingly, that seems to be biggest in the US and European Union in terms of business and research interest in that, and the UK actually as well as the EU. I think it's going to be huge, because you can't get to net zero without it. There's obviously controversy over whether or not companies and governments are going to rely on it too much as an excuse not to actually mitigate, i.e. cut their emissions. And so clearly that can't be allowed to happen, because there's been a lot of work done on public attitudes saying that if you don't do both at the same time, then support for CO2 removals drops a lot. But I think clearly we need more money into the £100 million competition the UK government's got for direct air capture. We need more of that. Companies like Drax want to build a bioenergy and capture storage plant to do this. There's another North American company doing some stuff in the UK just this week. So we're going to need it. It's going to take a long time to scale up, because it's tiny at the moment. Something like Climeworks, who you might have heard of, who in Switzerland, and Greta visited their site. They're removing about 6,000 tons of CO2 a year, and that's a drop in the ocean when you've got 40 billion tons of CO2 a year being emitted by humanity. So really important, a long way to go for CO2 removals, and not clear which technology will become one of the big ones. It possibly will become a kind of suite of them, I think, because if any of them are done really big, you get problems, negative side effects.
And I'll come on to that technologies point, because somebody they're logged in anonymously, but they've asked a question. You can to all the participants, you can upvote some of the questions that are being posted in the Q&A. So if you want them to be asked above some of the others, then please do click a like, and it will shift everything. I've already asked John's and David's though, so don't like those again. Anonymous attendee says, you spoke about some of the technologies that you've come across, and you were just talking there about some kind of new areas. Do you think that there are any existing technologies that are overlooked or not talked about enough?
Globally this isn't the case, but I think in the UK it's quite sad to see how much the focus has come off solar power. I think that's that is a very mature, commercialized technology that other countries are doing at scale. Yes, there's reasons around, land that may be an issue, but I think it's a shame that became an ideological issue and political issue in the last few years in the UK. And, I mentioned, for example, in my, everyone I spoke to said, look, because of the way that low carbon electricity generation seems to be going is increasingly about centralized and large scale. That's partly just the way the market has gone, and I think will continue to go. So, a few years ago there was this, so you are going to inevitably need more energy networks, more transmission infrastructure to carry that power around. But a few years ago there was a lot of hope of a more sort of decentralized world, which is we go back to kind of what we had pre kind of 1950, pre-transmission networks, where a lot of stuff was done locally. And I think solar has a really interesting role to play there on, whether or not it's the most economically efficient way of doing it is a question to have, a debate to have. But I think, the sort of million or so homes in the UK that have solar on their roof, that not only helps by, abating some of that need for that energy, transmission infrastructure, but also there's a really important role there about what it does for awareness and making this an everyday thing into people's lives, rather than something far removed that they don't understand. It's if you're having conversations with your neighbor about they're running their washing machine in the daytime because they've got solar and they want to make the most of it, that sort of stuff really percolates through to a daily level. I think that's really important
concept right down.
Yeah, so solar, I think it's just a real shame at a large and small scale that it's not played a bigger role in the UK.
Brilliant. We've got 1 minute left. I've got to remind everybody who's joined us at the moment, we've got our next session starting at 1:15. We've got a short 10-minute break. We've got Extinction Rebellion, Labour for a Green New Deal and Conservative Environment Network debating their visions of a net zero society. Can I just ask you for one quick comment? Stephanie's put a question in, it's been upvoted, and it's about the intermittent nature of renewable sources of energy, and is there not an inherent requirement for continued reliance on fossil fuels? A quick yes or no.
No.
Okay,
I think.
I'm sorry,
yeah,
we can't go into more.
I can do the long version of that online or something of why I say that.
Brilliant, thank you, Stephanie. I'm sorry that we couldn't give you a bit more detail on that, but thank you so much for all of you joining us today. I hope that you enjoy the rest of the sessions. Do encourage your friends. You can still register, sign up, and people can view it on demand. And we've also got another Net Zeros session hosted on the 15th of July that you can register to attend. Adam, thank you. It's been brilliant.
Thank you so much for having me, Melanie. Cheers.